White flight is just one example of a mass movement of people historically that affects our cities and neighborhoods today. Let's get into that some more. I'm not a historian, I'm a social scientist, as I mentioned. And to understand white flight from a social science perspective, you have to first begin with framing it as a mass movement of people or a mass migration. People move in groups, and groups of people move in ways that are patterned and predictable. At least that's what centuries of historical records and population data suggests. And so when we as individuals think about movement, we tend to think about that movement from an individual lens. But when lots of people move, it structures the choices that we can make as individuals. And it becomes less about our free will and more about the structures that guide or constrain our movement. Migration is heavily shaped by social structures. Things like politics, laws, our economy, our industries. These things influence where people cluster, where cities tend to develop or not, where movement happens. Okay, to build on the conversation on white flight and suburban sprawl, let's talk about four major mass migrations that have shaped our society. The first wave of mass migrations that shaped the social geography of our nation were three-part. The European settlement of this country, the transatlantic slave trade, which brought my ancestors, African Americans, to this country, and the original dislocation and genocide of the indigenous and native people that lived in the eastern part of this country. The second mass migration that occurred in this country was urbanization. And this was a feature of the industrial era. Urbanization is the movement of people and industry from rural to urban. So massive amounts of people in our entire economic model shifted over time from being agrarian and rural to industrial manufacturing and urban. When we industrialized, cities expanded in their population. Originally, cities were densely populated. People lived and worked in industries that were concentrated near central cities. Industries needed to be close to other industries and to railways and waterways. People didn't necessarily want to stop being farmers or stop living in small towns. Many people were forced to leave the countryside because opportunity simply left. Most of us know about the industrial era, but we don't tend to think about it as the thing that made us a city nation instead of a country nation. The third migration that shaped our cities is known as the Great Migration. And this is a little less talked about, but probably more common knowledge in Black households. The Great Migration was the movement of Black Americans from the rural South to the urban non-South. With the end of the Civil War and the industrialization of the country, there was more economic opportunity and less overt prejudice out west and in northern cities. So Black families began to move from the rural South to cities looking for opportunity. They began to settle in places like Oakland and Chicago and Cincinnati. It began as a slow trickle in the early 1900s and then really picked up momentum after World War II. There are a lot of places that colloquially we know of as Black cities or chocolate cities. Washington, D.C., Detroit, Cleveland. When you think about those places, especially the inner city, you tend to think about Black people. But we weren't always urban, right? So how did we get to be urban instead of rural? It was through the Great Migration. And finally, the fourth migration is suburbanization. So after World War II, you start to see more urban development outside of cities. More industry moves outside of cities, and more suburban municipalities begin to incorporate. Traditionally, suburbs are self-governed entities. They are next to cities, sometimes adjacent, sometimes further out, but they have their own resources. They have their own schools. They have their own city services. The emergence of suburbs and the trend of people leaving the city for greener pastures outside of the city was partially motivated by racial prejudice. It was facilitated by other social changes as well. The proliferation of the automobile and the highway system, technological advancements, and the rise of white collar work, laws and policies at every single level of government that incentivize developers to build out suburbia. So, how did suburbs become the predominant residential form? Follow along to learn more.